Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode. I'm here today with Helen Joyce, who is a journalist, formerly of The Economist, and she is now director of advocacy for the organization Sex Matters. Helen is also the author of Trans: When Ideology Meets Reality. And I'm very excited to speak with you today, Helen. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So I was thinking today we could start with and kind of center on the theme of language and the manipulation of reality that so many trans activists and others use as well to manipulate the reality of adults, but also of children. And I thought maybe a good place to start would be actually at the end of your trigonometry interview. They asked you what's a topic that you feel is not being talked about enough, and you mentioned childhood mental health, which is being talked about, but in the wrong way, as you said. So maybe we could start there with the question, what is it doing to children's minds, psyches, when we kind of open up this possibility to them that they might not be a boy or a girl, they might not really be what they are? What is that kind of doing to them?
That's a great question. I mean, I should say that since I recorded that interview, which I think might be a year ago or so now, there has been, a pleasing and useful uptick in people talking sensibly, including professionals, who talk about studies and who talk about the theories behind developmental psychology. So psychology understood as a developmental process. So I think I wouldn't now say nobody's talking about it. And since that's the question I was asked, it was a good thing that they weren't talking about it a year ago. I think society has changed so much in ways since I was a child, and more than it looks like over my lifetime, because Ireland was maybe 20 or 30 years behind certain demographic changes than England was. So I was born in 1968 in Ireland, and I'm the eldest of 9 kids. And that was a very unusually large family, even for the time. But 4 was completely standard number of children to have. Like nobody would comment on your 4th child. And kids played outside a lot more and in groups between themselves. And you learned to look after children who were a bit younger than yourself and to sort of negotiate things without adults around. It wasn't standard for adults to play with children. Children played and adults looked after the children and pushed them outside and said, come back for dinner. And so you learned to negotiate caring before you were an adult a bit. Like you learned to understand that children aren't just little adults. Whereas now when somebody comes from a very small family and maybe lives in an apartment in a city, or their parents don't have relatives nearby. I mean, I don't have relatives nearby. This isn't me mocking anyone, and I only have 2 kids. It's just the way that the world has changed. It's harder for children to grow up understanding what it is to be a child and what it is to look after somebody else, because you just live in a sort of a horizontal group of kids in your own class, kids at your own developmental stage, exactly, and there's no expectation that you are cared for by people who aren't yet adults, or that you look out for kids who are a bit younger than you. And so you grow up really surprisingly ignorant about children, even though you've just been one. So we've got this generation now, in England certainly, and maybe 2 generations by now, of people who, when they become parents, are not at all used to children. Like they may not have held a child. Like I hear people saying this, that I never held a child before I held my own child, which is bizarre to me because I was doing childcare from when I was 2. And I mean, obviously not terribly effectively, but I was expected to be mother's little helper from when my brother was born, and I was 18 months old when he was born. So people are very ignorant about children. They turn to books, and of course, if a book gets it wrong, then that tends to cascade out. Everybody's trying to. When you're selling a book, you're looking for the next big theory. Those are just standard things in publishing, but mostly you think they're just small adults, and you talk to them in a way that's not appropriate for children. So children are immensely concrete thinkers at the same time as being very imaginative. So you can't say to a child, you could be a woman when you grow up, meaning all the things that an adult might think around that. Like an adult knows very well you can't if you're a boy, but they also know that there might be ways in which that was possible if you thought that a woman was a social role or something like that. And of course, there are problems with all those thinking. But anyway, the point is that you've got a process whereby you can kind of think something is kind of true, but not really. Whereas children think you mean it, that there's a Santa. If you're a religious family, they really think you mean really God as a the sort of character that is an adult who gets cross with you or whatever. And here we are telling small children that they can choose their sex, and they think we really mean it. I think it's a deeply cruel thing, in fact, to do to a small child, because especially a child who isn't happy being a boy or a girl for whatever reason may very much want to be the opposite sex, but the thing is they can't be. And another of the things that you learn when you've been around children all your life is that it's not always kind to be to give them what they want. This is a bit obvious, like we don't feed children ice cream all day, we don't let them stay up late at night because it's bad for them. You learn to say no if you're around children a lot, and you learn to say no in the face of temper tantrums, a child being sometimes very unhappy, but you do it in a way that holds space and a boundary for them. I think that this is an ideology that, there's many things that were needed to lay the groundwork for it. I mean, people comment on the internet, on the fact that we don't work with our hands anymore, that people don't live close to nature, all of these. Like if you were doing animal husbandry, you couldn't fall for this bullshit. But I think that if we spent more time with children, as a matter of course, which of course human beings have done since the dawn of humanity until about 50 years or 30 years ago, depending on where you are, you wouldn't be so ignorant as to think you could talk like this to a child and have a child understand you in the way that you think you're speaking to them. It just isn't like that.
Mm-hmm. So do you think the adults who are doing that, they largely have good intentions, they want to help the children, and it's really born out of ignorance or an inability to kind of see things from the child's perspective? And
I mean, a variety of reasons. I don't like imputing motive. You certainly do see people and you look and you think, this is very exciting and interesting for you. People who parade their children on TikTok for whatever reason is not something I approve of. That's out there forever now, and the child is going to grow up, and there's no way that you know whether or not they want to, and I mean for any reason. But sometimes some of those people who are parading their kids on TikTok do seem to be very caught up in the drama of having a trans child and the kudos of it and the excitement and the specialness and so on. But I'm sure that most people, it's step by step. They found themselves in a situation they didn't understand. They did what everybody does now, which is you turn to an expert. The expert told them that this is a thing called gender dysphoria. It sounded odd to them, but I mean, who are they to question? And then step by step, you can do something that you would never have done if you'd been asked to do it in one go. I think most of the wicked things that human beings do are like that. That if somebody had given you the full description of where you were going to end up, you would never, ever have said yes to it. But step by step, you have found yourself there, and at some point it's too hard to go back. You've said yes to the child. I mean, imagine saying to a child, I have actually read an article by a woman who did this. She said to her children that they could be whatever sex they wanted, and about 18 months later realised this was an incredibly stupid thing to do, and then had to say to them, I'm sorry, that wasn't true. Mummy was wrong, you can't. But most
what
people...
what were the ages of those children?
Now, can I remember right? They were both under 10. There was some sort of reason. The older one, I think, really had badly wanted to be a girl and was, classic little effeminate boy. And the younger one, in a sort of a fit of social justice excess, they decided that they would always say to the younger child, you'll be whatever you say you are. And this poor little boy wasn't at all gender non-conforming and just wanted them to bloody well tell him what he was, which pushed them on a journey. And then they realised everything they had done was very misguided, and then they had to sort of row back, and then they had to cut off from friends, and, schools that had been so excited in one direction were enormously disapproving in the other, and so on. Most people, there comes a point that there's no way back for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like you mentioned, the school actually got excited about it, which is pretty disturbing in the sense that maybe they
I've
wanted
heard that
to
many
play the
times.
hero. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the schools feel like, oh, we can come in and be this savior role, we can be good activists, we can be on the forefront of this new civil rights movement that they call it. So the language that they use around that also changes the perception people have. So this is a civil rights movement. This is why we have to tell kids certain things, right? So the schools themselves, like you said, the parents, the authorities above them are telling them, this is the way your kid can change sex.
And I also, something else I was thinking about the language thing. I'm a very, very black and white thinker just by nature and by the fact that I spent so long studying mathematics. There's no room for maybe in the sort of pure mathematics that I did. There absolutely is in statistics, but that wasn't my area. I mean, actually, I worked in an area related to probability, so you are saying that things can be probabilistic, but it's very specific. An equation is an equation is an equation. And that's what started me down the road of thinking all of this was nonsense, was looking at a statement like a man can be a woman and thinking that 0 equals 1. And I mean, I stand by everything that I said about that. And when you put words into laws, they've got to have specific meanings. I mean, they can have shades of meaning, and they can be concepts like harassment that we judge case by case, on the facts of the matter or whatever. But all the same, they have to have meanings. And those meanings can't be poetic or worshipful sorts of meanings. Like, there's special words and ways that we speak when we're not trying to convey ordinary truths, that we might be trying to convey higher truths. And in some ways, it's almost grammatical. So I had to study Portuguese when I moved to Brazil, and Portuguese still has a very strong, what do you call it? The subjunctive. It has 3 subjunctives, past, present, and future, and it took me absolutely bloody ages to get them. And we've got very little subjunctive left in English, but we still do it when we say, God bless the Queen, rather than God blesses the Queen. And it's not an order to God to bless the Queen. It's a prayer to God to bless the Queen, or indeed King now. I'm showing my age again. Or may he be, that's subjunctive. And I often think the trans women or women thing is something like that. It's a may this person be a woman. I hereby declare this person to be a woman, in a sort of religious way, It's an utterance of faith. But because we don't think of it that way, we think of it as a flat statement like 0 equals 1, and that's how it gets put into law. And we're told that a trans woman is a woman exactly the same as any other woman. She's female, all of those things. But children don't do the whole, God bless the Queen, when you don't even really necessarily believe in God, or, may he live forever. Nobody lives forever. It's a thing to say, isn't it? So yeah, we're flattening a profession of faith into something that's acting out in society as if it's a law or a mathematical equation or theorem. And if we get, but that's what happens when you talk to children anyway. Like, you can't tell children that we believe this in the way that we believe in Santa, because they believe in Santa in a super concrete way,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's really interesting that you say about trans women are women is this sort of wishful trying to put it into existence. So that
It's may
makes
he
me...
live forever is what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we have trans women are women as the slogans, trans men are men, and then what does that mean for non-binary people are non-binary?
Well, I love that one, because it's like they ran out of something to say, I mean, they sometimes change it to non-binary people are valid. But the thing that annoys me about non-binary people are non-binary is if you look at the structure of the other two, they're saying A is not A, B is not B, and then they go C is C. Like, we
Right.
have to say non-binary people are binary or something,
Right, to
That's the
make
way it
it fit
works.
with the others. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think at some point you can't analyze these things too closely when they're changing too fast. Like, you can analyze the words of religious services much more easily, because they grew so slowly, and they grew through literally hundreds of millions or tens of millions of people, depending on what religion it is, saying them. They've been honed. Whereas this is a weird neo-religion that sprang practically out of nowhere and is changing very fast, with relatively small numbers of people changing it among themselves. Those people being some of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? The most volatile people. I mean, teenage girls on Tumblr or TikTok. And this is good and bad. I'm not trying to criticize anyone for this. Teenage girls are just, they're fashion hounds. They notice what changes fast. They're trying to get ahead of the game. But at the same time, they're trying to fit in, but it means that they move as a herd incredibly quickly. And there's not much wisdom of crowds there, really. And then at the same time that you're trying to impose this on everybody else as, as a fait accompli or as a state religion, so they can't talk about it. Because, I mean, the purpose of language is to talk. It's to talk and to listen, to communicate. But this is a big linguistic shift that we're not meant to notice and not meant to talk about. So it's a very stupid one, because the purpose of talking and listening is to make you more intelligent as a group. You share, all the minds work together, or they come to some sort of wisdom of crowds in some sort of way, but you're not allowed to talk about this. So you've got this, or so many factors make this into just a very strange linguistic phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thinking about telling a kid, not just, hey, you can change your sex, but also if they come to you and say, what am I? Am I a boy or a girl? To tell them, I don't know. That seems like it would just send them into this spiral of confusion.
Completely.
How do they even
Kids hate I
that?
don't know.
Mm-hmm.
They hate I don't know. They want grown-ups to know things. They expect you to know things. I mean, a few times I haven't done, like when my children were small, they're both, one's an adult and one's nearly an adult. When they were small, they asked me things that I just couldn't understand what they were asking me, and it got them quite distressed because I couldn't give them an answer of the sort they wanted. And, it's very comforting for children to be given a clear, developmentally appropriate, hold the space type answer. Can I give an example here? What am I going to be when I grow up? That's the thing a lot of children worry about and think about. And they wonder, or they say, like, who will I marry? Or where will I live? They can't imagine getting from here to there. And you can't just say, well, it'll become clear in time, because that doesn't help. You have to give them the right amount of structure at a developmentally appropriate stage for them, without lying to them in a sort of comforting way. So you talk a bit about, how you made your own decisions, obviously leaving out any, age inappropriate things. You explain that when people are older, they understand better what their interests and strengths are, because that's the sort of thing they can fit, And when there's just a fact, you have to just tell them that, well, you could never be American president. We weren't born in America. That's a condition of being an American president. You have to be born in America. Could I be a ballet dancer to a child who has some physical reason they can't be a ballet dancer? It's cruel to tell them they can be. It's better that they absorb young, that there are things they can't do, and then they can focus their energies where they can do things. I mean, actually, that's quite a good analogy with careers. Someone related to me used to be a careers consultant, and he once told me that the hardest people to do careers consultancy for were extremely talented people who had very wide range of talents all over different fields, because it was hard for them to choose where to focus their energy. And actually, somebody who had no talent as great as all their talents, but it was very clear what they were best at, would end up better at that thing, because they focused their energy there. So if there are things that just aren't going to be for a child, like if a little boy wants to be a mother, badly wants to be a mother, and some little boys do, it's not kind to let them continue to think that, because they should be putting their energy elsewhere, because it's not going to happen. So they need to understand it's not going to happen, and not in a mean way, but just in a, well, that's the way it is. Boys can't do that. They can do a million other things. You could be a daddy, but not a mummy. And then they've got time to get their head around that and put their energy into things where they actually can do stuff. Like, I often think about all this gender stuff. Like, imagine the time we've wasted on all of this. Like, I often hear people say the things we women could be doing if we weren't doing this. But think of the energy that children are wasting. All those crap lessons teaching them nonsense. All those poor kids going on gender journeys of all the tedious things they could be doing with their finite lives.
Yeah, what a great point, right? It's all the energy and the life force they have is almost just being dissipated outward into that fakeness, because it's not real. So there's nothing that they can really create or hold on to. If they do try to transition, ultimately, I hope that they won't experience regret and complications, but very often, especially the people I've interviewed and spoken to, they do experience horrible regret and medical complications. And so the whole thing that they were working for, like you said, it kind of falls apart. So all that effort was really not only for nothing, but for their own self-destruction in a way.
But even if it all works out fine, like whether that's because they just go on a sort of a gender loop that doesn't take them down any irreversible pathway and they end up back, or they go on a pathway that they end up feeling worked for them, whatever, it's a fundamentally tedious sort of thing. It doesn't make the world a better place. It doesn't make you a more enriched person in ways that it would to. I'm not saying it makes you an impoverished person. I'm just saying it doesn't make you an enriched person. There are other things you could have done. It's a profoundly solipsistic and inward-looking thing to do. I mean, focusing on your gender, I can't imagine anything more boring than focusing on your gender. And that's not just because I don't have gender dysphoria. I just mean generally speaking. I don't know if you've ever read The Tombs of Atuan by Ursula Le Guin.
I haven't.
It's one of the Wizard of Earthsea books. It's really very good. They're really very good series. But in this, it's about the priestess of a religion that's kind of dying, and there's no point in going into the plot. But quite late in the book, she realises the whole thing has been pointless. That she was taken as a baby from her family, meant to be the reincarnated. I think she's even a god, not a priestess. And she's been taught these incredible rituals that she has had to spend her entire life doing. And now she's nearly an adult and she knows nothing. She's seen nothing of the world. She's never met anyone who wasn't inside that cult. All the knowledge that she's been given was pointless and it could just be let die. And it makes me think a bit of that. Like all this thinking, am I neutral? Am I genderqueer? What precisely is my gender identity? Which bits of me do I want to keep? Do I want to microdose on tea? Am I part of the LGBTQIA++ community? It could all vanish, all of it, and nothing else would be connected to it, and nothing bad would happen as a result. It's not like what would happen if we got rid of all of mathematics or all of medicine. It's not a real field. It's just a hermetically sealed nonsense like the cult that she's describing in Tombs of Atuan.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that applies to just sort of thinking about gender in other ways too? Like, let's say a feminist exploration, if I'm going to spend many months or many years thinking about what does it mean to be a woman, is that a similar, waste of time? Is it just
No, I don't mean that at all. I mean, that's not something I've done much of myself, but then, we only live one life and I was doing other things. I could totally see that being worthwhile. I mean the sort of the inward self, like the examination of your gender. So these books, I remember when I was writing my book, I talked to a wonderful woman, Susan Matthews, who had done a study of gender workbooks. And one of the things she said to me is that these read like the 19th century books that kids were given in very religious families to do what was called the examination of conscience. So I was taught examination of conscience as a child, as a Catholic. But of course, it was, my parents were brought up very much more strictly, loads of hellfire and loads of damnation. So the idea is that you put some time aside each week to think about yourself and to think about what you've done wrong and how you've sinned and so on. And I now regard that as actually a harmful practice. And not because I think it's bad to admit that you get things wrong, but I think that sort of inward focused, it's self-indulgent and it doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't make you do better things. There are better ways to become a better person. But it's very like that. It's like, have you thought about your gender? How much have you thought about your gender? What answer did you come to? And you end up creating problems. Like people who took this sort of examination of conscience very seriously, the sort of serious, maybe lonely or introverted child who took it very, very seriously, who had a very religious family and got very scared about hell, could really talk themselves into being quite mentally ill by doing this. And I see gender as like that. That's my issue with it. It's not that there aren't things that gender means that are interesting, or that we couldn't ask ourselves questions about what it is to be a man or a woman. That's not what I'm saying at all. I mean the inward, how have I sinned? Have I thought enough about this? Have I worked out where my soul is precisely on this colour chart of genders? This is not good for people's mental health, not at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's this sort of, there's this aim that you're supposed to achieve with it, and with all this ruminating.
But it's not something that is achievable. Mm-hmm. Like it is an endless task. Mm-hmm. Like we do sin, none of us is as good as we're meant to be in that, if you're going to use that language. Like every day we sin in small and medium ways by omission and commission, as the words say. So it's endless. Thinking, examining your conscience is endless. And at least you get absolution in the Catholic Church. You go to the priest and you tell him your sins. And, I stopped doing this when I was a teenager, so I never got to the point that I had any very good sins. So it was all very much about, shouting at my mum and getting cross with my brother type stuff. God, can you imagine being the priest listening to this stuff? And then they finish by saying, all right, 6 Hail Marys or something. They give you a penance to do, and it's always just say some number of prayers. And then they say, go now, my child, and do not sin again. Another, do not sin again. They know you're going to sin. You'll be back in 2 weeks' time telling them the same stuff. But at least you've been given absolution. You can come out, it's over. The slate is wiped clean. Whereas this examination of gender is an endless task. And I think that's kind of its point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that it goes on forever. And I remember that part in your book where you talk about the workbooks for children, and there was one that was for 7-year-olds where they're telling them to write a letter to their gender, which was very strange, hard for me to even understand what that means. And it reminded me of something that I talked about when I interviewed Eliza Mondegreen, who's a grad student researcher, and we discussed how we both lived through social contagions when we were in high school. For me, it was the cutting contagion. For her, it was anorexia. And we both kind of discovered that we mutually had the same source of finding out about these contagions, which was school, the teachers in health class.
Yeah.
So under the guise of education, we were exposed to these contagions. So how much have you found that these types of workbooks will, kind of create the gender identities in the children?
I mean, it'd be a very interesting research project and not one I'm equipped to do, to work out where people had first heard of these things. But these ideas are now out of the, they're out in the wild. It'd be hard not to have, come across as stated fact, the idea that people have gender identities that simultaneously they're innate, but also can change, that you must look inward for yours, but they're demonstrated by outward signs, like all these things that, not to belabor the analogy with religion too much, but these things are mysteries. Like, obviously on the face of it, they're just contradictions. But actually in religion, mysteries are contradictions. They're things that you're meant to say, well, God will understand it. I will understand it when I'm with God. I can't understand it now. My mere mortal mind can't get my head around the idea that you could simultaneously have to do such an examination to discover your gender, but actually everybody's born with a gender. So, that idea is, I would say, unless you've come up against somebody giving you an alternative view, you will take that now in school as fact, the same way that you take anything else they're teaching you as fact. Because it's everywhere. It's in Disney films, it's on TikTok, it's in any other social media platform you use. I mean, I sometimes see things that teachers do and say, and I mean, they have no idea what they're talking about. If they're older than about 30, all they know is that this is right and proper and social justice-y, and they must do it. And unless they are actually religious or right-wing, which not that many teachers here at least are, most teachers are very much left-wing and often atheist as well, or agnostic. So unless there's a reason, you won't ever have come across the idea that these things are just a recent American neo-religion that's been imported. You just think it's true. You're astonished the first time someone tells you it's not true.
Right.
So, I guess a lot of people are getting it in school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had a 14-year-old student who I tutored previously, who she told me she was non-binary, and I asked her, why do you identify this way? I didn't want to start a huge conversation about it. I'm there to teach her how to read better. She had dyslexia. But I asked her, what did that mean to her? And what she told me was that she didn't want to grow up to be a housewife and have to wear skirts all the time. And I just thought, I don't think that that's the predominant cultural message, that girls have to do that, at least not in the liberal areas that she was being raised in. I think that she's being told that that's the message for her. She's being told that other people will tell you that this is what you have to be as a woman. But I don't see that as the actual message. Do you think that that's sort of passé now?
No, I mean, I think if there's an unpleasant message, it's that you're going to have to be permanently sexually available, wear acrylic nails, get hair extensions, and be as keen on no string sex as your average 18-year-old boy is. Like, those are the toxic messages that you're being given. But I think if you are told that unless you identify as something other than cis, you're fair game for other people to land any types they like on you, I think that's true now, actually. Like, it shouldn't be. It's incredibly regressive. But just as a matter of fact, within the framework that they're being taught in schools, unless you say that you are not cis. I mean, I was talking to a young woman recently, and she's left school now, but she was at a school I know. And she was complaining about how non-inclusive the LGBTQ plus society in the school was. And I mean, I know somebody else at that school who's actually gay and who says it's just absolutely full of straight girls who dye their hair and call themselves queer. So, I mean, just, one group is thinking this has to be for everybody. Because if it's not for anybody, if there's anybody it's not for, then it's not inclusive. And the other side, it's like, well, this isn't for me because I actually have an unusual characteristic, and there are occasions that I quite like to talk about that. But what's the point in being here? Those people, there is no connection between these two groups.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's another big linguistic trick, this LGBTQ thing. I was remembering the other day when I came back from Brazil at The Economist, it was the end of 2013, and I started working as a section editor at the beginning of 2014. So that was the point at which I started to have responsibility for commissioning editing copy. And I distinctly remember an American correspondent writing in an article LGBT. And we changed that to spell it out because it wasn't familiar enough for our audience, we thought, or for all of our audience. And now, if you just say somebody's lesbian or gay or bisexual, that's almost weird. They're LGBT, everybody's LGBT. And as my friend Simon Fanshawe says, what, all of them?
Right. Right. Are you lesbian and gay and bisexual and trans?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, he's just an old-fashioned gay man is all.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of people who say things that make no sense, I wanted to ask you about this quote that I saved from Grace Lavery, who's a professor at UC Berkeley.
God.
And he wrote an article for the LA Review of Books, so quite a prominent journal. And
not sure it's that prominent, to be honest.
Okay.
But anyway,
fair enough.
I think the New York Review of Books is prominent. The LA Review of Books not quite so much. But anyway, yes, continue.
Yeah, well, and it's certainly degraded by having stuff like this in it. But he reviewed both your book and Kathleen Stock's, and he talked about some other players in the criticism of gender ideology. And the end of his article, and I think this really goes to the manipulation of reality.
Sorry, can I just ask you, did you read the whole thing?
No, I did not. I did not read the whole thing.
Okay.
It was hard
to
read and understand, and I skimmed through it, and I didn't think he was even making any sense. But at the end, he says, reality, the reality shared by women, actual women in the world, really does matter for feminism. Metaphysical definitions of the category woman really, really don't. So, as you rightly guessed, this was not something that I could sit down and read very easily at all. So, I did, and I skimmed through it. And this last part really, I mean, just everything in in those two sentences to me seems like a reversal. Can you help me kind of unpack what he's doing with that, saying that real women, actual women, that's not defined as an adult human female, of course, because he believes that he is a woman.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to put thoughts into Grace Lavery's head.
Yeah.
I could imagine two ways in which someone might think that it's a bit trivial to be banging on about what precisely you mean by woman. And one of them is, it's the usual whataboutery gambit, which is to say, you're faffing around talking about who gets to be a woman, while out there, people we all know are women are getting raped or getting murdered, etc., etc. That's called whataboutery. Like, it tends to be that the people who care about the definition of women also care about those things, and the people who are attempting to shoehorn men into the category of woman are not the ones who care about those things. So if that's what he means, and I don't think it is, that would be my answer to it. I think he's trying to say that woman is something like pornography, in the famous definition of pornography from an American court case that you know it when you see it. And that if you try to define pornography very closely, you end up with absurdities. Like, maybe you don't know this, but if you ever watch a black and white film, if there's ever a woman who's in a bra-type top, she'll have a little pasty on her belly button, like hiding it. And that's because one of the things they did, one of the decency rules was that you couldn't see the belly button. And their point was they wanted to try and join the bit between the boobs and the bit between the groin together. But of course, people worked out, you can just cover the belly button. So you could make porn that you cover the belly button. You see what I mean?
Okay.
So it's actually very, very, very hard to define porn, but we do all know it when we see it. And I mean, okay, there may be boundary cases where you think, like, is this, sort of a bit titillating erotica, or is this, just a sort of a, wildly attractive woman who's gyrating to reggaeton or something? But I mean, there's a lot of porn that you just look at it and you say it's porn. So I think he's saying a woman is something like that it's something we all know when we see it. But there's another thing that they bring up, and I think this might be Sally Hines said this one a few years ago, but it's someone of the gender bollocks people. She's saying, and I'm now, apologies, although I don't like apologising to Sally Hines, apologies if I'm not remembering correctly, but anyway, let us pretend that some gender bollocks person has said these words, and I think Sally has said something like them. The chromosomes can't be the definition of woman because we only found out what chromosomes were recently. Okay? So we see the outside of people and we know who's a man and a woman from that. So why are we talking about something on the inside of people as being the distinguishing factor? So, I mean, this is dumb in quite a lot of ways, and one of them is that what's on the outside of us is our chromosomes. Like, the chromosomes gave the instructions for building the body. So when you look at my features, the reason they're similar to people in my family is because we share quite a lot of genes. And the reason that I'm clearly female is because I do have XY chromosomes. But also, it's like saying that carbon and methane can't be the cause of global warming because we only recently found out what the elements were. But I mean, the thing is, the global warming was happening before we found out what elements were. We worked out what the elements were that caused global warming and how they did it. So yes, we saw the difference between men and women, and now we know what causes the difference between the men and the women. I mean, I have to say, I do often wonder whether Grace Lavery is sincere precisely in meaning exactly what he writes down. I think a lot of the time he is making provocations. And I think he'd probably agree with that because that's that style of writing. That sort of postmodernist, Judith Butler does it all the time. She's forever asking questions. She's like, and could it be that gender gender precedes sex? Like, yes or no, Judith? One
right,
or the
like
other.
A student who doesn't actually know what to write.
Exactly. So there's a lot of that in it. Maybe it sounds clever, or maybe it's intended to make you think, as opposed to being the sort of factual statement that you get in the hard sciences, and actually in good soft science as well. Like, if you read really well done social science research, it doesn't do this sort of bullshit. Like, it's going to be dealing in probabilities and in things that are correlated and that we're not sure what the causation is, but it won't be written in that, could it be that, and perhaps, and I think we'll find, and it just, it's just, I think we're probably, but you know what? We're really paying this more attention than it deserves.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, and you're right about the provocations thing. I think Lavery definitely does that, especially on Twitter. I
don't know. I don't look very wise.
Right. So, and
yeah, no, I read him on Twitter because he was doing that event. He asked to do that event when he came to London, and then he called us all some variety of fascist. And so I haven't looked since. And life is better.
Yeah, he sort of bowed out of the debate. I think that he had maybe agreed to do with you at one point. But so when you mention about we can't know that chromosomes are what define sex because we didn't know about that until recently. Well, isn't that like saying we can't know that the Earth orbits the sun because when we look, it looks like the sun is going around us, and we didn't know that until recently either. Is that a similar analogy?
I mean, that, they would then come back with some clever remark like that, according to Einstein, nothing is fixed and the Earth and the Sun rotate around each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're someone who finds this at all entertaining intellectually, like, have at it, is what I would say. But it's not getting us anywhere. It's not illuminating us in the way that a good model does. Like, a good scientific model allows you to understand the situation better than you did before, but in particular it allows you to make predictions that you can then verify or test and verify. And if you can't verify them, then you reject the model. So I'm not interested in the sort of inordinately long rambling around, is woman a cluster concept? Is it like pornography? I'll know it when I see it. Noting that people who have XY chromosomes have bodies that develop along one line except when something goes wrong, and people who have XX chromosomes have bodies that develop along the other line unless something goes wrong, and things mostly don't go wrong, and they go wrong only in very specific ways, and so on. It's an immensely fruitful theory. Like, it just allows you to do so many things, and it allows you to do things right, not just in medicine, but in social science as well, in just all sorts of ways. Like, why would you throw that away? It's one of the most incredible theories we have. Like, it is for humans what what Einstein's theories or quantum mechanics are for physics. They allow you to do so much more than you had before.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to the sort of termination of the ability to think things through, with the confusing, jumbled word salad that we
It's
see.
sort of self-referential wibble is what I would call it.
Yeah, that's a good turn of phrase. So tell us about what you're doing with Sex Matters right now.
Oh God, so many things. I mean, there's just so much to do and so few hands to do it. So Sex Matters now, how old is it now? Gosh, I think it's 3 years old. But it's been an entity for around 3 years, and then Maya started working properly for it when she won her court case. So what's that, about 2 years now? Probably getting the dates all wrong now. And I came on board initially for a year. I left The Economist for a year's leave of absence, which started, and I can remember the date of this because it was April Fool's Day, on April 1st, 2 years ago. And I just didn't go back because I was too busy. So what I'm doing is really just whatever needs doing, and the things that we're working on most at the moment are trying to get decent schools guidance out on the issue of gender questioning or gender distressed children in schools, or just in generally, like, how do schools handle the fact that there are some kids who say they're not the sex they actually are. And we've got a conversion therapy bill coming up here, possibly, but definitely in Scotland. We're commissioning and publishing our own research on various interesting issues about single-sex services and spaces, about what it's like to be in a workplace when you have gender-critical ideas. What else have we got coming up? Or are we at? Basically, just there's so much stuff going on that, and we're small, we're 6 people, and no one except Maya full-time. So, yeah, and then against us is the full might of like about 500 organisations, including Stonewall and most HR departments, and an awful lot of miseducated teachers, civil servants, politicians, all sorts. It's incredible, really. Just trying to hold back the tide of crap.
Yeah, it's a lot. And how do you advise schools to deal with this? I mean, let's say the schools did want to turn this around and do the right thing and tell the truth to the students, but maybe the students have at this point been fully indoctrinated. What are some of the guidelines that you're giving to the schools?
I mean, we're not in a position to give guidelines to schools. What's happening is the government is writing a draft for schools on what they should do. And it's quite interesting, really, once you look at the rules and regulations and laws that bind schools already, it's quite clear that in the UK, at least, our analysis is that you cannot transition. You cannot transition kids at school. You cannot have children socially transitioned in a school at all. Because there's, there's maybe 4 or 5 different binding constraints on what schools do. And some of those are quite specific and technical, but some of them are very overarching. I mean, I'll give 2 examples of the technical things. It is a it is a law, as in statutory duty on all schools in the UK, whether they're private or public, to register children when they come in. And when they come in first, you show their birth cert. And there's special procedures if a child is, for example, an unaccompanied refugee or has no papers. But if they've got a birth cert, you must show it. And that has to be recorded in a certain way with no leeway, and that has to be passed on every time the school transfers the whole way through their career in education. You have to record every child's sex, and you cannot fiddle with it, and you must pass it on. They're not doing that. Some schools are changing things on that, but that's, School Regs 2006. It's there as a statutory duty. If we can make them do it, that's data sorted. Another example is the School Admissions Code, which covers all the state schools. There are very limited criteria that schools can use for admitting kids. And they are, I may leave out something, but they are sex, age, religion if it's a religious school, distance from the school, having a sibling in the school, being in care, or otherwise having a statement, as it's called, saying you should have to go to that school. You're not allowed to include a feeling of being the opposite sex, and you're not allowed to do anything that's not transparent. Your published admissions criteria have to be transparent. So you can't go admitting boys who say they're girls to girls' schools. It's against the admissions code, and that's statutory. So there are those sorts of things that schools are just blithely ignoring at the moment because lobbyists have persuaded them that they must, that somehow really a boy who says he's a girl is a girl. And then there are these overarching duties, in particular safeguarding. So if you seriously think about keeping children safe in education, which is the name of a statutory piece of guidance, KICSI as people call it, you can't pretend that children are sex they're not. You can't keep children safe when you're doing that. You can't make a child an exception to school rules that distinguish between boys and girls, as anything about spaces or single-sex sports and so on is. Like, it's a school rule. School rules are there to be followed. You can't just exempt a child from those. If a child cannot follow those rules for some reason, then that child cannot be fitted into mainstream education, and you must think about how to educate them otherwise. But this, of course, isn't at all the approach that schools have been taking. And the government has done this legal analysis now, and we don't think they've got it all right, but we think they've got it about 70-something% right. And they've put this out as draft guidance for schools. And it's not actually really about trans kids at all. It's about how do you deal with the fact in a school environment that children have sexes, remembering your duty to not discriminate, to keep children safe, to follow all relevant regulations. And they've put that out for consultation, but the lobby groups are telling schools that it's motivated by transphobia, that it's the latest iteration of homophobic school rules, which a previous Tory government did actually have, like I'm talking 40 years ago. And they're telling them that they don't need to do anything now because it's only a draft and it's only a consultation. But the thing is, they lay out their legal reasoning. Like, they say why you have to do these things, and it's laws that are already on the books. So it's incredibly depressing to see, what ideological and intellectual capture can do for you, and how far people have gone from the right path. So I guess we're just going to see some schools caught by schools inspectors and marked down and so on before this happens. Like, I thought you could tell them. I thought you could say to people, look, think about it. Think about what keeping children safe in education means. Think about what the school regs say. And they'd say, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't get that. You're right. No, they say this is the Tory culture war.
Right. And when you get responses like that, I've heard you say that you always try to keep this cool tone, that you were told early on by an editor, the hotter the topic, the cooler your tone should be. Have you ever found it difficult to keep that cool tone?
Well, I don't do very many face-to-face things on these sorts of things because we're not in a position to with so few people. So we're doing policy analysis and, putting that out there and trying to get attention. And, as and when we'll be mobilising supporters to write to schools and parents to go into schools, and we'll be giving them key points that they can make and pointing them to the relevant regulations. I have tried all of this with my own son's school. He's in his last year of school at the moment. I wrote it up about a year ago and for a publication here. It was so distressing, or depressing actually, more than distressing. He's not gender distressed or anything like that. So I was doing this just because I know 5 other parents at the school who have kids who are. And none of them was willing to put their name to it because, you're afraid that you're going to get into rows with your kid. So I put my name to it and I wrote them a careful legal analysis, and they brushed me off, and I went through the full complaints procedure right to the end and got nowhere. And at every point, they just, failed or deliberately failed to understand what I was saying. Like, I mean, I looked back through the documentation the other day, and it's in dozens and dozens of pages. And over again, I say to them, your trans policy says that children must be allowed to use whichever toilets they want. However, school regulations say that when children are over the age of 8, you must have single-sex toilets. You have mixed-sex toilets that you have put the signs male and female on. And every time they answered, we have single-sex toilets according to the regulations. And it's there in their policy that everyone can use whichever toilets they want. So at some point you don't know what to say to them, Like if you've internalized the idea that a boy who says he's a girl is a girl to that extent, that you can't see what I'm saying here. I mean, I think it's got to be the school inspector. It's got to be the government putting out guidance, and then the school inspector is marking you down. Or, worse happening, a child being hurt. Because there's a reason we have these rules.
Right. And I remember also hearing you say on one of your many podcast appearances that you had spoken to a woman who told you that at one point she had really convinced herself that she couldn't determine, the difference between a man and a woman. And so, can you tell us a little more about how we can convince ourselves, how we can, shift our own perceptions with this language game? How strong is that? I mean, pretty strong, I think, but how deep
I
does
think
that
pretty
go?
strong, and I think you can never see it from inside, can you? I mean, I think that I'm constantly trying to question myself, but I would think that, wouldn't I? Like, we all think we're independent-minded and that we have good perception and that we're making justified decisions. But I mean, none of us are. We're all making very socially mediated decisions. I mean, you only have to look at things that you believe that really almost no one believed 100 or 500 or 1,000 years ago. I mean, I think it's obvious that it's fine to be gay. But, like, really, nobody thought that in Ireland just 2 generations ago. Like, really, almost nobody. So presumably I wouldn't have, because I don't think I'm that special. It seems obvious now that same-sex marriage is okay. I mean, I'm old enough to remember some of my, some changes. Like, I remember when the law changed in the UK so that a man could rape his wife, like, as in it was possible that it was rape. Like, before that, forced sex, a woman was deemed to have irrevocably given her consent to all sex with her husband when she married. And I remember seeing or hearing it on a news bulletin when I would have been in my early teens, I think, and thinking, God, that's strange. I mean, how could a husband rape his wife? So I know that the ideas and the framework that I work within, or the human rights framework, for example, I spend my day talking about the human rights framework because all that we do is within it. Freedom of belief, freedom of speech, freedom of association, the things like the Istanbul Convention and that, which require you to accept that female people are women and women are female people. But the human rights framework is a very modern conception. Like, the idea that people have inherent rights of that sort is very new. So it doesn't seem odd to me that people have talked themselves into beliefs that feel right to them. I mean, it's extraordinary that it's something as concrete and profound as our sex. But people have very strong commitments to their tribes, their intellectual tribe, their friends. If everyone around you thinks something, it's very hard not to think it. And, it's easy for me to say, well, maybe I'm more independent-minded than other people, but I'm 55, Sasha, Like, not many people my age think this stuff. And if they do, it's almost certainly because they have a child who's forcing them to. And also, I was at a paper that's not left-wing. So, I mean, I often wonder, could I ever have been persuaded of this? It doesn't feel very plausible, but, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Maybe, I mean, given the amount of pressure sometimes that's on people to conform their thoughts to it. I remember when I first was learning about transgender ideology, and I was actually trying to make myself do that. I was trying to make myself see Laverne Cox, who was the example at that time, as a woman, and I was trying to see him as a woman, and I couldn't do it. And that was the moment that I became sort of, you know, an outsider from my peers in that regard. And but there are other things that I've fallen into. I know that, other beliefs I've fallen into that I later had to say, well, I think there was maybe a social incentive for me to believe that, and it wasn't correct or wasn't true. So I definitely have, a lot of sympathy for that, because like you said, we're maybe not as strong-minded as we like to think we are, although maybe some individuals are more than others.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's human variation in everything, so there's surely human variation in that too. But like literally nobody used to think anything remotely close to, any universal declaration of human rights, like any one of those things. Like you read it out, like nobody thought that. So, and to me now, it's a guiding principle, really. So, yeah. And then there's things that people believe. I'm interested in the things that people believe that they don't test because testing is too dangerous because you've been told it's catastrophic. So the example I often think of when I think about the poor parents who are told their child will kill themselves if they aren't put on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones is the I think it was the Aztecs. Yeah, the Aztecs who sacrificed human victims, in particular children, by tearing their hearts out on the platform, on the altar of the because the sun wouldn't come up. The thing is, like, you only have to wait one day without sacrificing kids to see that the sun will still come up. But do you dare? Like, that's a very big risk to take. So, I can't imagine saying to myself about my own child, well, I could try. I could see if they kill themselves. You know what I mean? Like, you just couldn't say that. And I mean, maybe not having any friends is obviously an awful lot less serious than having your child harm themselves. But it feels pretty damn catastrophic to teenagers to think that you will have nobody speak to you. Like, I didn't like it when people were looking at me a bit askance. And, frankly, I don't really care. But if you're 16, it feels like your whole world. So I guess you get with the program and you see what you need to see.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it does feel like a cult, like a religious mentality in that sense. And, it's funny, I have to say, J.K. Rowling's detective series, which you also mentioned in your book, some of the furor around one of her books, where the murderer dressed as a woman one time. But I've noticed that the trans activists don't react when she has sort of veiled plots. I don't know if you read those series, that detective series
I
at
do.
all.
They're great. The latest was the best. They're great. Yeah. But I mean, really, if you're going to read all of them, because you've got to get to the latest one. It's brilliant.
Yeah. And I've noticed in some of the other ones, there has been absolutely no controversy. Like, for example, the latest one, The Cult. You could definitely make an analogy, a case that is a lot of, represents a lot of trans activism, the trans cult. And then she also had, in one of the other books, there was a plot line about people who were sort of trans-abled or trans-disabled, I guess. And they wanted to be disabled. And the main character he actually is an amputee, and he was very offended by these people. But there was no controversy around that. I think it sort of went over their heads that
or possibly it's just not flattering, like what's the flattering thing that you can take away from that? I mean, I suspect, and I don't know this, but I suspect that she has said that her interest in cults goes back a long way. I suspect her interest in cults may even have set her up to see trans activism as a cult. But I mean, I don't know that, so if that's wrong, sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, that's quite an interesting thing. Yeah, she definitely has that deep interest in cults, and it's funny because I do tutor students, and I often ask them if they've read Harry Potter. They all still read Harry Potter, and it's still completely something that kids love, and yeah. So, they can't take that away from her. But
you know what they do on the fan sites, on the fanfic websites like Archive of Our Own and that, like people keep writing Harry Potter and then they write this sort of disclaimer at the beginning saying, you have to say, I don't know how important it is to say this legally, but there's always this thing where they say the characters here are J.K. Rowling's, not my own, and they'll say the characters here are J.K. Rowling's. May she come back to her senses and soon, or I'm so sad to see J.K. Rowling, go down this dark path, and I hope she sees the light. But Harry Potter was the character of my childhood, and I'm going to keep using it. And I often think, like, that just proves that you don't actually think that she's that bad. Because if I were to fall in love with the Charles series and then discover that a genuine real-life monster, like Hitler or Goebbels, had written it, I would lose interest in it. Like, imagine knowing that the person who'd written these things had gassed children or something like that. Like, had sent Jewish children to the chambers. You wouldn't ever be able to spend your, years of your downtime writing fiction based in it. It'd be just too awful, too sad. So they don't really think she's bad. They just feel they have to say it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, they are loving the feeling of being immersed in this world. They find it comforting. They find it beautiful. They find it inspiring. That's all coming from her mind. That is her mind. So, and I've even seen where they'll remove her name. They'll say, oh, this book is not by J.K. Rowling. It doesn't have an author. Or they said on Twitter, RIP J.K. Rowling. That was trending, which was so appalling. And it was kind of an example of that, using language to wish something into existence in a really sick way.
And not in a very real way. It's a bit like, a child saying to, like, I think most children have probably at some point said to their mother, I hate you, I want you to die. Like when you've had a really big row over something, they don't want you to die. Like, they're children. It's an expression of anger. It's a childlike thing that, it's not just that children have lower impulse control. It's that, what's inside and what's outside them is not as clear to them as it is for adults. Like when you watch a 2 or 3-year-old having a tantrum, they think the whole world has exploded. Like, the anger that they're feeling is everywhere. It's outside and in. And as you become an adult, you become kind of integrated. You know what's inside you and what's outside. And these kids, they're kind of being tantrumy. They're acting like they can just go, I hate you, Mum, you're horrible, you're mean, and then get over it and on with the day, sort of thing. Like, it's just, and childish and not in a good way.
Right. Yeah. And then unfortunately they can get results. Sometimes they can get people fired with these tantrums. They can really scare companies and organizations into doing what they want.
I mean, that's the companies and organizations' fault. Like, I mean, tantrum's gonna tantrum. Like, I've had 2 children, and the second one of them was a world-class thrower of tantrums. I mean, absolutely hilarious. At least once a day for about a year and a half, from 2 until well after his 3rd birthday, he would have at least one massive, massive tantrum. I'm so glad he wasn't my first child. I'd have been too scared to have a second one after all of that. But we were fine with it. It was, we could cope with it. We understood how to let them pass. But like, the idea that I would ever give him the thing that he was tantruming over, absolutely not. Like, I try and avoid the tantrums as best I could, but you don't give in to tantrums. Absolute madness. They continue if you do. So, I mean, in some ways I don't blame these kids. They haven't been taught self-control. They haven't been given decent boundaries. They haven't been shown standards to live up to. They do what kids do, which is they act out, and they're mean and self-centered and narcissistic and so on. And then the adults let them away with it and encourage it and reward it. Like, that's the foolish thing. Just say to them, that's very badly behaved of you. We don't take snitches around here, thanks. And they wouldn't do it again.
Right. And it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning about children's mental health, because it doesn't feel good to have a tantrum. The kid doesn't feel good when they're in that state. They actually want to be comforted. They want to be calm. Well, sometimes they reject, comfort. They need some space for it to be ignored.
They sometimes just want to be held, It's very scary to think, and it's very scary if people around you act scared when you're having a tantrum, because that reinforces the idea that you feel the whole world is breaking down. And if people around you can just be calm and continue to speak calmly and continue to say the same thing as they were and say, when you're ready to talk, we'll be, that holds space for you and a boundary, and you can calm yourself down. You know that the other person is holding the world together for you when you can't hold the world together. I wouldn't like to tweet at a big company about a show or an employee or something and have them respond to me, I'd be like, oh God, this is a bit scary. Like, is the world that unpredictable? Could this happen to me? Could this happen to anybody? Like, could one sentence blow the whole world up like that? I'd like to know that our institutions are stronger than that. So I don't think even they like it, really. Well, I mean, some of them do. Some of them are narcissistic little fools. But I think a lot of them are pushing to see where the boundary is. Children do that. They like to know where the boundary is, how far they can go.
Yeah, and then they can settle in if that boundary is set. Otherwise, it's just keep going, keep going, keep going. It's spiraling.
I mean, I actually think the non-binary thing is that. The non-binary thing is in some ways a search for a boundary. I was thinking this the other day, listening to an adult talking about a non-binary child. And the child wasn't even there, but the adults respected the child's pronouns. And it was so difficult, and it really put me off talking to them about the child because I know the child. And I don't want to play along with this, but I also don't want to act like I'm making a point. And it just made me think, like, this child isn't even here and yet is controlling the conversation of a group of adults. And they're really nice people, these parents. I really like them, and they're great people, but they're like super liberal. There's nothing their child could do that would annoy them. Like, any of the things like getting a piercing or a tattoo or any of those things that one could do, they'd be fine with it. And they'd certainly be fine with a same-sex partner or somebody of a different race. It wouldn't even occur to them not to be, It's actually very hard to know how to rebel against a parent like that. Like, where's the line? Well, they found it. Like, their parent is that dumb that they're going to talk about a child that they're flesh and blood, that the wife gave birth to. They're that dumb that they'll talk about that child as not having a sex when that child isn't even there. Like, wow, what next? What will you do next? Will you pretend that I'm immortal? Will you pretend that I'm a fish, that I can fly? Like, just like at the bit where they should just have said, that's nice, dear, we're not doing that.
Right. And I mean, not at all to say this about those parents. And I also have talked to people who I really like as people. It's the same thing, my kid. And I notice, oh, I know your kid is your daughter, but you're not using pronouns. So I know what's going on here. And these, great people sometimes. But when you were saying that, it made me also wonder for the kid, does that then make them question other things the parent tells them? Like good things? Like, I know this is kind of extreme, but I love you. I mean, can the kid believe their parent in everything?
I mean, this is a somewhat older child. This isn't a little one, so I don't know that it's that. I think what it may do for an older kid is, frankly, feel some contempt for the parents. Like, are you that easy to manipulate? I mean, what else could I make you do? What else could I make you say? My father used to tell this story about me when I was very little, when I would have been about 2 or 3, and if I fell asleep in the afternoons, then they couldn't get me to bed. So late afternoon or around dinner time, my mum would put me on the doorstep to wait for my dad coming home from work. He used to get a bus and then walk the last bit, and I would be absolutely exhausted. I have a picture of myself sitting like this on the doorstep, like falling over and doing this. But anyway, one day when he got home and he was on the far side of the road, and I sort of saw him there, he said hello to me, and I stood up and I said, "Don't cross the road." And he stepped back onto the pavement. I said, "Come here." And he tried to come here again, and we did this several times, and my dad was going like this, and then finally he was like, "You have to come across the road." So he did, and by the time he got to me, I'm screaming my head off, So I feel like these kids are there, they don't even know what they're doing. They're waiting to see what will be your breaking point, or how far they can push you. And I mean, as far as my kids are concerned, they can't push me at all, thanks. That's how far they can push me. So they don't push me. They don't try. They're not always trying to take the piss and work out where the boundary is, because it's very, very, very clear. That's what I think.
Yeah. And I interviewed Stephanie Davies-Arai, and she had this point about practice your sort of no-nonsense voice, where you respond to if your child is coming to you and saying something that doesn't make any sense, like, I'm really a boy now, I'm not the girl that you birthed. You just kind of practice your no-nonsense voice, like, well, of course people cannot change sex. And then you go on about what you were doing. And it's kind of similar to what you're saying. I think that there's boundaries, just sort of no-nonsense, clear boundaries, not angry necessarily at all.
and not unnecessary and not done deliberately to pick a fight.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my dad had to cross the road. He needed to come home. He wasn't doing this just to be mean to me.
Yeah.
He wasn't tickling me when I'd said I didn't want to be tickled or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I don't mean be an arsehole to your kids, and I don't mean, insist that you overrule them on things like what colour paint they have on their walls, or whatever. So I mean, another one that my father always did when we were little, he hated he hated my brothers doing any sort of hairstyle that was fashionable. And for years and years, because I've got a lot of brothers, I've got 5 brothers, so it's me and then 3 boys and then a girl and then 2 boys, and the 3 boys who were younger than me, what you did was you sort of spiked your hair up in ways that are not worth trying to explain in the 1970s and 80s. And he would try to pounce on them as they were leaving the house to go to school. And every morning was a big fight on the subject of hair. And I hated this so much that when we were planning to have kids, I said to my husband, I am never having any discussions about hair. And in fact, both my sons have done horrific things with their hair on occasion. Like grown them really long, dyed it blue, bleached it, cut it to really short so that it looked like a mugshot, and I strictly will say nothing about hair. And the result is they both have quite ordinary nice hair now, So yeah, it's not, I don't want people to listen and to think that, I'm some ultra martinet of a parent, or that I suggest, getting into fights, or like my word is the law, or whatever. I just mean I'm just not going to get into negotiations about things that are ridiculous. And I'm not having my children tell me what I think about things, thanks. They can tell me what they think, that's fine, but I mean, I'm not going along with it unless I think it's sensible. And by the way, I'm the grown-up and they're the kids.
Right. And then with that, they know that if mom is never going to say a word about our hair, like you said, there's not going to be that rebellious attempt at rebelling, because it's not going to get them anywhere. Right.
Yeah, and it just saved us so much grief as well. God,
Yeah.
pick your battles, as they say.
Yeah.
And you know what as well? When you're not easy to wrap around a child's little finger, they're much more impressed when they are able to tell you something you didn't know. So if my kids say something to me and I say to them, wow, I didn't know that, that's a real accolade. Or you explain that really well, I never thought of it that way. Whereas if I'm just always, wow, you're so clever, that's amazing, you want to be this, you want to be that, you want to be the other, like how do you compliment a child if
Right.
if you're that much of a pushover?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's one.
God, I sound like I think I'm some sort of amazing parent. I don't mean that at all. But I mean, I think about the gender issues, and I just look at people and I think, why are you going along with this? And I don't mean the ones where they're really in the trenches. I just mean these kids who are really trying to wind their parents up.
Yeah, right. And another thing that came up with Stephanie Davies-Arai was about child-led parenting, and she said this is the advice that's being given to parents, is that it's not just child-centered, it's child-led. So, and getting towards the end, not to take up too much of your time, but last couple of questions. But here's one example. In the daycare where I work, so we have babies and toddlers. And one thing that a lot of the staff does, I've noticed, is they'll say, "Can I check your diaper?" But sometimes the kid will say no. So then you have to do it anyway. Yeah. So, is it better to not ask? Is it better?
You just say, "I'm going to check your diaper."
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then if there's an issue, then the child can say, no, I mean, suppose their tummy's hurting or something like that. Like, it's maybe not a good example, because if they're still wearing diapers, then, you're just going to have to check their diaper. But if you talk about a child who's a little bit older and it's time to go out now, like I see people saying, let's go out. Are we going to go out now? And the child says, no, but you've got to go out. You've got to get the shopping. And you don't give them the bum's rush, and you don't give them no notice. You say, we're going out now. It'll be time to get ready in a minute, so let's start putting our toys away. And if you're just very reasonable about these things, and if you're not a capricious sort of person, then that's fine, And children know that the world is big and scary, and they want adults to make sense of it for them. They don't want you to be asking them things that they can't possibly know the answer to. I was just thinking there when I was at GenSpect, there was a filmmaker, Travis, he got me to read some lines from a book that was about, it was all parents of children who identified as trans, and they were these incredibly crazy and sometimes very disturbing quotes. But there was one who said, we both have degrees in gender studies, but we've learned more from our little trans, I think it was a trans boy, meaning a girl, age 7, than we learned in our courses. And you're like, I mean, A, what you've learned from your child is nothing. This is a child who's saying they're the opposite sex, so it's nonsense. And B, you spent whole degrees, both of you, and you learn nothing that a 7-year-old. You think what a thing a 7-year-old can tell you was more than you learned in your degrees. Like, it just is the most incredibly damning thing to say about gender studies. Like, I know a shitload more than my children when they're small. They know a lot more than me about certain things now. I expect to be the one who has the answers. And they expect me to be the one who has the answers, actually.
Yeah, and there's something to the idea of there's a certain kind of knowledge that maybe you can't gain from books, and maybe children contain this knowledge, but I feel like that's taking it way too far to the point where
I'm not sure there is.
Okay.
I mean, you learn a lot from your kids, but what you learn is a saintly degree of patience and how to put yourself second and how to do things when you're absolutely knackered. And a sort of certain love that you're never going to feel for anyone else, I think, than your own children. So but they're not teaching you stuff. Like, you learn from them, which is different from them teaching you stuff. No, I teach them stuff. Like, I'm the one who knows what's dangerous. I'm the one who knows, sadly, what happens if a car hits you. And I know how much it hurts to fall from a height. I know all these things that I have to protect them from. So yeah, it just... If we had continued having a society where most people knew much more about children and had much more confidence in the both right and responsibility of adults to parent and to be adults. Because, all these companies as well, they're acting like children when they cede their responsibilities and their authority to people who are tantruming online. I mean, they call that there's a word, adultification, that people who study safeguarding talk about. When you talk about children as if they're older than they really are, and it's one of the things that enables abuse. Just today, actually, there's been a lot of talk about horrific child abuse of girls in care homes, mostly in care homes in northern cities in the UK. And the police and social workers really didn't do anything about it for a very long time. And, part of it is there was a racialised element to it. But partly it was these girls were 13, 14, 15 in care, and they were often kids who'd, for whatever reasons, their awful home situations, they were kids who'd already got girls who'd got into a lot of trouble. And I mean, the way girls get into trouble is by sleeping with men, taking cigarettes and money and sweets and praise and some attention for sex, even when they're just 12 or 13 or whatever. So anyway, they were talked about as young women or young females instead of as children. And that's part of what makes you overlook what's happening. Or it would be saying, that girl has a boyfriend. Well, the boyfriend is 30 and she's 14. So instead of saying there was an adult and a child, so the child is adultified, and it stops you from thinking about the specific vulnerabilities of a child and the specific responsibility of adults. And then at the same time, these adults are childifying themselves, if that is a word. They're ceding their authority, they're passing on responsibility, and they're patting themselves on the head for being good people for doing it because they're so modern and progressive and child-led, and they're learning so much from their little trans guy. And, it's wrong on all levels.
Mm-hmm. And what's also interesting that strikes me is as we are adultifying these kids, they're also kind of like screaming out to hold on to their childhood, because if they're asking for puberty blockers or something like that, they don't want to grow up. Maybe those two things are connected. They are feeling so uncomfortable.
So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's like it's like sometimes people say, you have to toughen your kid up because it's a hard world. Well, actually, people who are given right-sized challenges and protected from things they shouldn't see when they're little and allowed to grow up at a modest pace, grow up into much more secure adults who are much better able to handle challenges than kids who are given challenges too early that break them and that are developmentally inappropriate. So a child who has too much put on them when they're too young, like, imagine, I wonder what these parents are like with that kid that they say they learned so much from their little trans guy. Like the kid must know that he's got nothing much to teach the world yet. He's only a child. He's only a little child, or she. I can't remember whether it was a boy or a girl. I'd be scared. I'd think that the people around me don't know what they're doing, that nobody's going to protect me. I know that I don't understand the world, that the people around me aren't doing it. No, I want them to keep me safe and tell me what's what, and make sure that things are okay for me as I grow up at a modest pace. And then, along comes puberty, and it's all very confusing and so on. And if somebody offers you a way to stay as a child, yeah, I definitely. Yeah, it's like saying, toughen up. It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then they have to seek this sense of safety somewhere.
Yeah.
And so Helen, thank you so much. We've talked for a while now, and I kind of want to just end on a fun question, which is, since we were talking about the Strike series, and I also love them so much, do you think that Strike and Robin will get together?
Oh God! If they don't, I will be quite upset. But then I always watched Buffy wanting her to get together with Angel and getting very annoyed when she didn't, and so on. So yes, I mean, she's a good enough writer, of course, J.K. Rowling, that she'll make it work, whatever she does. Although she did put Ron and Hermione together, and that was an absolute travesty.
That's right.
In my opinion.
Yes.
But I mean, Robin and Strike would be great together. Yeah, I hope so. That was a cliffhanger, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Definitely. She keeps doing that to us.
Yeah. Yes, it's been nearly every book, hasn't it?
Yeah. By the time, at a certain point, I just thought, all right, maybe she'll save it for the very last one. And she'll keep us on tenterhooks until then.
Yeah. Yeah, they'll head off into the sunset at the very last page of the very last book. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Well, Helen, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you, and it was wonderful to have you back. When I was very first canceled, you were my first ever interview for YouTube.
Oh, was I? I didn't realize I was the very first. That's lovely.
Absolutely. So I really appreciate you coming back and sharing so much knowledge and wisdom with us. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Sasha. It's great to see you again and see you doing well. I'm delighted.
Excellent. Thank you.